Just this week, the governor of Virginia declared a state of emergency in response to Tropical Storm Debbie. And it reminded me of some comments that viewers left on a video that I put out a few months ago where I expressed pessimism about the long-term future of the comic book market because of the declining fertility rate. Of course, as all of us know, the market is determined by supply and demand. And so if there's less demand simply because there are less people, then prices are going to go down. Well, some viewers responded by saying, hey, wait a minute, that may be true, but have you considered the impact of natural disasters on the comic book market? Because earthquakes and floods and wildfires are destroying comics every year and decreasing the supply. And of course, a reduced supply can help the comic book market maintain its prices. And I thought that was an interesting point because, of course, you can never increase the supply of older comic books. In other words, if an Incredible Hulk 181 is destroyed in a fire, well, you can't all of a sudden make a new one and start to sell it. And so the question then becomes, will the decreased demand that comes from a reduced fertility rate be offset by the decreased supply that comes from natural disasters? And so I thought we could talk about that question today, both in the scenario where natural disasters maintain basically their current rate, or the one where some climate scientists predict that they begin to increase and we're headed towards an apocalypse. Now, I'm going to do as best as I can not to get too political here and insert my own opinions about whether or not either of those scenarios are more likely, but we're just going to look at both of them. So in the first case, where we have basically the same amount of natural disasters that we do now, I maintain my pessimism about the long-term health of the comic book market. Because although it may be true that the absolute supply of comic books will decrease, what really matters is the amount of supply that's for sale. In other words, it really doesn't matter how many Incredible Hulk 181s are in existence. What matters is how many of those books are for sale. And I think that we're just going to see a lot more comics being put on the market from boomers and Gen Xers aging and selling off their collections before they pass away, or their family selling them after they pass away, than books being taken off the market from natural disasters. Now, of course, that's hard to predict, especially because you can't really find numbers of how many comics are destroyed every year. Insurance companies don't release that kind of information. But in my anecdotal experience, I've come across a lot of older collectors who are looking to move on from their collections. Obviously, that's where I buy the most of my comics from. Then collectors who talk about, oh, well, I just lost everything I had from a wildfire or an earthquake or whatever. Now, obviously, that happens, but I just don't think it happens nearly as much as older collectors looking to sell their books on the market. And once again, if all of a sudden there's less demand on the market, then prices are going to go down as that supply increases. But of course, that's all just speculation. So you tell me, what do you think is going to happen in the next 20 years? Do you think we're going to see more books being put on the market or more books being taken off the market? Now, before I get to the scenario where I talk about what happens to the comic book market if we're headed towards the apocalypse, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, of course, I'd appreciate it if you consider doing so now. Now, what happens to the comic book market if AOC, Greta Thunberg are correct? Climate change is an existential crisis and we're heading towards the apocalypse. Or AI takes over and destroys most of human civilization, or the Israel-Palestine conflict leads to nuclear war, or just some doomsday scenario from many things that we could be fearful about. Well, I think in the short term, it causes prices obviously to crash. In a doomsday scenario, no one is thinking about comic books. They're thinking about how am I going to eat, how am I going to survive, and there's no disposable income because they're just trying to live. comic books are, of course, a luxury. And so if we end up in an apocalyptic environment, then we're not going to be looking for that luxury in the short term. But in the long term, it could lead to a resurgence in the comic book market. Because in this apocalyptic scenario, currency will ultimately become totally worthless. In other words, if I am struggling to get any food for my family, then once I get a hold of some, I don't care if you have $1,000 or $1 million, I'm not selling my food to you. And in this scenario, eventually what would likely happen is that society would rearrange itself with these tribal kind of communities. And in these communities, I think you would probably have an elite at the top. It's kind of like different tyrannical governments that you've seen throughout history, where the people at the top live with an insane amount of luxury, while the people at the bottom barely have enough food to survive. And when you study these kinds of leaders, similar things even today in some third world countries where there's tyrants, these leaders have so much luxury that they don't care about getting more food, and so they start getting interested in things like art. Things like having their chairs inlaid in gold, just crazy luxurious things. And in that scenario, I could see a tribal leader being like, hey, I've got all the food that I need, I've got all the gold that I need, what else could I use? Oh, well, there's some of these historical pieces like Amazing Fantasy 15, Incredible Hulk 181. And then they start to barter for these things. And some peasant comes and like, sir, I've got my 9.8 Incredible Hulk 181. And he's like, oh, well, here's a day of food for you. And then they sell it. And then over time, though, these tribal leaders start valuing those comics more. They become scarce again. And then they pay lots of food for these comics. And eventually, as society rebuilds itself, currency is reestablished, and the comic book market explodes once again. Now, of course, this is all just a fun exercise, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Now, what if there is an in-between of these two scenarios? So, climate events do increase, but we don't head to the apocalypse. Well, that could have a number of effects. For instance, it could cause supply chain disruption. Of course, we all experienced that during COVID, where you have trouble transporting paper or other materials that are needed to make comics. And this could lead to a couple of things. First of all, the rise in the cost of materials, which then means comic companies begin to charge more for their comic books, which then means all of a sudden there are fewer consumers willing to pay the prices for those comic books, especially if the price of food and other material goods have gone up. So you lose customers in the new comic book market, or kind of similar, either because of that or just because of the desire for more sustainable practices, people begin to turn to digital comics more than they do now. And in both of those scenarios, in the short term, it would only affect the new comic book market once again. But in the long term, it would begin to affect the secondary market as well, because the secondary market is dependent on nostalgia. And if you have fewer people buying comics, or they're just buying digital comics, then they don't have the nostalgia associated with floppy comics. And so when they get of age to buy comics that are more expensive, then they just don't care. And that would then drive prices down as well. Now, there are other potential ways climate events could impact the comic book market, but I feel like I've shared enough today to get a conversation started. Tell me what you think in the comments, whether you agree, disagree, or think of other potential effects of climate events on the market. Now, I said I'm not going to get too political in this, but I at least thought I should answer the question, what do I think is most likely? Will we be in scenario one, where the climate continues basically like it is now? Will we be in scenario two, where we see the apocalypse? Or will we be in scenario three, where we're somewhere in between? Well, I'll just say this. So probably my favorite American of all time is Teddy Roosevelt. And if you know anything about his life, then you know that he was a huge conservationist. The reason we have the national park system is because of Teddy Roosevelt. And I really embrace pretty much most, if not all, the values that he had about a lot of different things. Not completely, but most things. And so I also hold the value of conservationism. And I want to leave the earth better for my children, for my grandchildren, for my great-grandchildren, for my great-great-grandchildren, which might give you a clue into realizing that even though, again, I see conservation as important, I personally don't see the apocalypse coming. Although I certainly think there's lots of things to be concerned about in the short term. Ultimately, in the long term, I personally am optimistic about the future of humanity. And that is for a lot of reasons and touches on a lot of subjects beyond climate change. Maybe I'll explore some of them in a future video. Tell me in the comments below, do you like this type of video? If so, maybe I'll touch on some of those. Tell me, are you optimistic about the future of humanity? Pessimistic? Again, how much do you see climate change playing a role in our society and specifically in the comic book market? You know, obviously, the comic book market is just small peas compared to the future of humanity. But it's a fun exercise, hopefully, that gets us all starting to think. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, again, I appreciate it if you consider doing so now. Thank you.